It was not until his 22nd year that Hervey Deo realized that he was taking life too seriously. Then the realization struck him sharply. He had been a serious infant and had nursed more from a sense of duty than pleasure. His juvenile marble and hoop games had been grave affairs, conducted with nicety and decorum. He learned to read shortly after he was breeched and at 7 presented a slip at the public library for the encyclopedia from A to Z. The librarian demurred, but he gently insisted. He was permitted to carry it home volume by volume. At 12 he had resolved to be a scientist and furthermore a great scientist. He determined to pursue the career of ornithologist. There was something so dignified and withal scientific about a science that called the sparrow passer domesticus and the robin erithicus rubecula. He made rapid progress. On his 13th birthday he took a bird walk at dawn and was able to record in his notebook the scientific names of 49 birds, including the rubian topaz hummingbird, Chrysolampes mosquitus, which is rare around Boston. At 15 he wrote a daring monograph which proved beyond cavil that it would be possible to revivify the extinct great auk, Plautus impennis, by a judicious and protracted series of matings between the penguin, Spheniciformes, and the ostrich, Struthio camelus. This theory was hotly challenged by a German savant in a 70,000-word exegesis. Hervey Deo crushed him under a 100,000-word rejoinder and thus at a tender age came to enjoy a certain decent celebrity in the world of ornithology. At 17, still in the university, he was becoming known as a first-rate all-round bird man. He rather looked down on old Fod at the Natural History Museum who was a beetle man and particularly on Armbuster who was a mere bee man. Yes, Armbuster and his bees decidedly wearied Hervey Deo. As if bees counted. Something revolutionary happened to him in the spring of his 22nd year. The mild spring evenings, biology, inexorable nature conspired against him. His mind began to reach out for contacts with new things outside the world of birds. He made the disturbing discovery that he could be interested in things unfeathered, girls, for example. He made this discovery at a tea to which he had gone, most reluctantly, with his mother, who was intensely serious about her social duties. He found himself sitting on a divan beside a girl. Her hair was blonde and bobbed and she had an attentive little smile. To be polite, he explained to her the essential differences between the European redstart, Phoenicurus phoenicurus, and its cousin, the American flycatching warbler, Psittophaga ruticilla. As he talked the notion grew on him that teas were not the bore he had thought them. It disconcerted him when the girl rather abruptly left him to join a fattish young man who had just entered. Hervey Deo could tell at a glance that the newcomer had not the intellect to so much as stuff a lark. His alert mother spied his lonely state and steered him to another corner and another girl. He sought to fascinate her with an account of the curious circumstance that the male loon, Gavia immer, has 3 more bones in his ankle than the female of that species. He told her this in strictest confidence, for it was the very latest gossip of the world of ornithology. He could not but note that after 15 minutes her attention seemed to wander. Presently she murmured some vague excuse and slipped away to join a laughing group in another part of the room. He followed her flight with a glum eye. The group appeared to have as its center the fattish young man and it was growing distinctly hilarious. Hervey Deo had a pressing, but, he told himself, wholly scientific interest in learning what conversational charm or topic made the fattish young man so much more interesting than himself. He edged his chair within earshot. The fattish young man was not talking. He appeared to be making a series of odd noises through his nose, varied now and then by throaty bellows. Nork. Nork. Whir. Whir. The trained ear of Hervey Deo was puzzled. Clearly they were not bird noises, yet they had a scientific sound. Perhaps the fattish young man was a scientist after all, a mammal man. Nork. Nork. Whir. Whir. The girl with the attentive smile solved the mystery. She called across the room. "Oh, Bernice, do come over here. You simply must hear Mr. Mullet imitate a trained seal." Hervey Deo felt actually ill. So that was the secret of Mr. Mullet's powers, that was the magnet. Nor. Nork. Whir. Whir. Hervey Deo couldn't stand it. Stiffly he went out, and as he took his hat and stick he could still hear the laughter and the fainter, Nor. Nork. Whir. Whir. In a fury of disgust he went to his laboratory and so violently stuffed a grackle, Euphagus ferruginus, that it burst. Next day he realized that something annoying had happened, was happening to him. He could not keep his mind on his work, it kept straying, despite him, to the little girl with the attentive smile. She had been interested in his talk of birds until the accomplished Mr. Mullet, imitator of trained seals, had made his untimely appearance. His teeth gritted together at the thought. That afternoon he surprised his mother by suggesting that he accompany her to a tea. She was glad his social consciousness seemed to be aroused at last. They went. "Who is Mr. Mullet?" he asked her as they rode teaward in her motor car, a product of the seriousness applied by Mr. Dale, Sr., to his brick business. "Mr. Mullet? Why, he's one of the Brookline Mullets," his mother said. "Why? Is he an animal man?" "No, he sells insurance." "He seems popular." "Oh, he has some parlor tricks." "I beg pardon, mother. The allusion escapes me." "Parlor tricks," repeated his mother. "He imitates a trained seal. It appears to strike the younger people as excessively comical. I believe he can also swallow a lighted cigarette." Hervey emitted a polite moan. "Must one do parlor tricks?" "They have their uses," said his mother. The girl with the attentive smile was at the tea and Hervey Dale captured her. Her name was Mina Lowe. He was congratulating himself on having interested her in his new monograph on parakeet bills, when she sprang up with a little cry of pleasure. "Oh, Mr. Dale, there's Ned Mullet. Let's get him to imitate a trained seal. He's perfectly killing." "I do not know seals," said Hervey Dale, severely. "They fail to attract me. I am a bird man." He left the tea with a heavy heart while the talented Mullet was bellowing, "Nork. Nork. Whir. Whir." Lying in his bed that night the brain of Hervey Dale entertained two thoughts. One was that Miss Lowe was a singularly charming girl, the other was he could not interest her by birds alone. How then? He analyzed the situation with the same care and logic that he applied to the dissection of a hummingbird. His conclusion was revolting but inescapable. He must master a parlor trick. He shuddered at the notion, but he was resolved. "The end justifies the means," he muttered. He rose early and attacked the problem with the weapons of science. In his notebook he carefully wrote down all the animals and the sounds they made, with comments and remarks on their value as entertainment. Anteater. Wee, difficult. Buffalo. Roar roar, uncouth. Bull. Horror roar roar, too like buffalo. Beagle. Yirp yirp yirp, lacks dignity. Elephant. Aru aru, hard on one's throat. He went through the list of the mammals and the result was disappointing. None of them seemed so interesting as a seal, and besides, he did not wish to lay himself open to the charge of plagiarism. He could not, of course, employ the calls of birds, although he was rather good at that. It seemed sacrilegious to employ ornithology as a parlor trick. He turned his attention to the noises made by inanimate things. He jotted down in his book, foghorn, buzzsaw, locomotive, saxophone. He was considering them with furrowed brow when Armbuster agitatedly burst in. He disliked Armbuster, he gave himself too many airs for a Meerby man. Hervey considered it rather an imposition when Armbuster was given an adjoining laboratory at the museum. "Have you seen her, Deo?" cried Armbuster. "Her? Who?" "My queen. She's escaped." "No," said Hervey Dale coldly. It was annoying to have one's thoughts broken in upon to be asked about a wretched bee. "If you do see her, be sure to tell me," said Armbuster. "Certainly." The bee man vanished. Hervey Dale again bent over his notebook. He added the words, "dentist's electric drill," and was considering whether Miss Lowe would regard an imitation of it as unpleasant, when a faint sound caused him to turn his head. A large bumblebee was crawling up the window pane grumbling to herself. Hervey Deo watched, listened. His first thought was to capture her and return her to Armbuster, and he reached out his hand toward her. She bumbled noisily and eluded him. It came to him as a flash of inspiration that his problem was solved. He'd imitate a bee. He knew it was not honorable to keep her, but he did. He spent the afternoon chasing her up and down the pane with a gloved hand. She muttered and grumbled and buzzed. Bzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz, bzzzzzzzzzzz, bzzzzzzzzzzz. He smiled a smile of grim triumph. What was a trained seal's raucous bellow to this? Softly he imitated the sounds she made, patiently he practiced. Before dusk came he was satisfied with the perfection of his imitation, and yet not entirely satisfied. The thing lacked a dramatic quality, it came to no climax. He could buzz loudly and softly, angrily or soothingly, but there was no grand finale. He felt that one was needed. Mr. Mullet ended his seal imitation with a crescendo roar. A thought, murderous and ruthless, shot into one of Hervey Deo's brain cells. Normally he was neither murderous nor ruthless, quite gentle, indeed. But love brings out the primal man. For the sake of Mina Lo he would, for a second, be atavistic. He chased the protesting bee across the pane. He got her into a corner. His gloved hand closed on her. She buzzed frantically. He closed his thumb and forefinger smartly together. He cut her off in full buzz with a sharp incisive sound like a torch plunged into a pond. A perfect climax. Hurriedly, furtively, he fed her corpse to a live flamingo in a cage in the corner. On his way home he passed Armbuster in the hall. Armbuster was distractedly searching for his queen. He was peering under a rug. Hervey Deo did not meet the bee-man's eye. In his room that night he practiced assiduously his new accomplishment. Bzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz, bzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz, bzzzzzzzzrf. He attained perfection in that final shrill, staccato bzzzzzzrf. His mother, hearing the sounds, came to the door to ask if he was ill. He called her in. "Listen," he said. Bzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz, bzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz, bzzzzzzrf. "Oh, dear," she cried, "a bee. Where is he?" Hervey bowed. "I am he," he said. He amazed his mother still more next day by asking her to give a tea for him at the earliest opportunity. He mentioned, matter-of-factly, that he wouldn't mind having her ask Miss Mina Lo. He planned the seating scientifically. He saw to it that he and Miss Lo were seated together in a quiet corner near a window. When she had finished her first cup of tea, he turned to her suddenly, his eyes excited. "I say, Miss Lo. Look. Bzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz, bzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz, bzzzzzzrf." He pretended to pursue an imaginary bee up the window pane and to catch him at last. "Oh, it's a bee," she cried. "Where?" he asked, with a smile. "Oh, it's not really one. It was you." "Oh, do it again." He did it again. Bzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz, bzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz, bzzzzzzrf. She clapped her hands in ecstasy. "Oh, Mr. Deo, how perfectly wonderful. I didn't think you." "What?" "Oh, do let me call the others." "If you wish," said Hervey Deo. They gathered about him. Bzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz, bzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz, bzzzzzzrf. They were enchanted. "Oh, do it again," they begged. He did. With a gracious smile Hervey Deo acceded to their request. He glowed. He was tasting the heady draught of sudden popularity. Late arrivals at the tea were told of his accomplishment. They insisted on hearing it. Bzzzzzzzzzzzzz, bzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz, bzzzzzzrf. Quite casual acquaintances came up to invite him to their homes, to teas, to dinner parties. He smiled and promised to come. From the corner of his eye he could see that Miss Lowe was regarding him with something very like interest. He went to a dinner party at the home of Professor and Mrs. Murgatroyd. He had been stuffing an emu, Dromius irroratus, and it had so absorbed him that he was late. He entered with the fish course and the guests beamed expectantly. "Oh, here is Mr. Deo," cried his hostess. "We were so afraid you'd disappoint us. I've been telling everyone about your perfectly delicious imitation of a bee." He obliged them. Bzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz They encored him. One of the guests was the fattish young man, Mr. Mullet, but the spotlight had shifted from him and he sat eating morosely and regarding Hervey Dale with bilious, jealous eye. During the dessert Mr. Mullet essayed to bark like a seal, but Mrs. Murgatroyd looked at him disapprovingly and he never reached the roared climax. He buried his chagrin in the Pechi Melba. Hervey Dale, observing, smiled quietly to himself. After dinner he had a tête-à-tête with Mina Lowe. For her own special and private diversion he twice repeated his imitation. On the second occasion he ventured to take her hand and she pretended to be so absorbed in the imitation that she did not notice. 3 nights later he called on her at her home. It was with difficulty that her young brothers were finally dragged off to bed. The imitation fascinated them and Hervey Dale was forced to do it no less than 7 times. He was getting to be a virtuoso. He could keep it up for 5 minutes at a time, now pretending that the bee was in the lampshade, now under a glass, now behind the piano, and even up the pant leg of the youngest Lowe boy. When he and Mina were at last alone together, he pretended that the bee was buzzing very near her blonde, bobbed hair. In capturing it, he kissed her. Their engagement was announced the following Friday. The notice in the local newspaper pleased and yet vaguely disturbed Hervey Dale. It described him thus: Mr. Hervey Dale is well known in local society. He is a gifted scientist and has gained a reputation for his ability to imitate a bee. As he reread this he could not but feel that some reference should have been made to the fact that he was the author of an authoritative work on the cuckoo, Cuculus canorus, that he was a doctor of philosophy, and that in the fall he was to become chief curator of birds in the museum. Still, he reflected, newspapers haven't room to print everything, they strive to print what to them are the salient facts. He and his fiancée went about a great deal and the party at which Hervey Dale did not give his imitation of a bee was adjudged a sterile affair. Frequently he congratulated himself in those days that it took a man of science to know when to be serious and when not to be. They were married in August, and no less than 17 friends sent the happy pair various representations of bees as wedding gifts. They received bronze bees, porcelain bees, silver bees, gold bees, and a pewter bee. His colleagues at the museum gave him a handsome bronze inkstand made to resemble a beehive. On his return from his honeymoon, Hervey Dale threw himself into his bird labors at the museum with energy. He was a bird man, even a first-class bird man, and so far his ambition was gratified, but it still burned with a hot unappeased flame. He wanted to be the biggest bird man in the world. However, after his marriage he permitted himself certain digressions from the relentless pursuit of this aim. There was a constant demand for him socially and, as Mina was fond of teas and parties and bridge and balls, he found himself giving rather less time to his birds than formerly. He was by no means averse to a measure of social life. A great scientist can afford to have his human side, he assured himself. Wherever he went with Mina, be it tea, party, bridge, or ball, he was invariably pressed to give his imitation of a bee. He would bow, he would let them insist a bit, invariably he gave it. Bzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz, bzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz, bzzzzzzzzrf. No stranger ever came to the city who did not, sooner or later, hear that screamingly funny fellow, Dale, and his perfectly killing imitation of a bee. His fame spread. He had been married a number of years and had a child or two when he came home one evening visibly excited. "My dear," he called to his wife, his voice full of excitement tinged with awe, "tonight I am to meet Professor Schwiebel. He just came to town. Think of it. Karl Humperdinck Schwiebel." "Schwiebel," said Mina, blankly. You don't mean to say you never heard of Schwiebel? I'm afraid not. But I've spoken of him score of times. Oh, perhaps you have, she said, yawning. I thought he was a bird. Why, Schwiebel is the biggest birdman in the world, he exclaimed. It will be a big night in ornithology when Schwiebel and Deo shake hands. He must know my work, of course he must. He can't have missed that great Auk monograph and the cuckoo book. He was so excited he could hardly tie his dinner tie. Schwiebel, he kept repeating, the great Schwiebel. I've wanted to meet him all my life. He comes just at the right time, too, just when my paper on the Pyrula Europea, bullfinch, my dear, is causing talk. Don't forget your galoshes, admonished Mina. Hervey Deo, red, proud and flustered, was introduced half an hour later to that great Bohemian savant, Professor Schwiebel, at the University Club. Professor Schwiebel made him a courtly bow. Charmed, Dr. Deo, he said. I have heard much about you. Hervey Deo bowed deeply, he was warm and crimson with pleasure. Oh, really, he murmured. Yes, said the distinguished visitor, who hath not heard of Deo, the bee-man. Deo. The bee-man. I. Hervey Deo was stunned. I, a bee-man. Oh, no, 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 no. Pardon. Pardon many times. You are but too modest, said Professor Schwiebel, wagging his index finger at the stricken Deo. But surely you are that same Deo who makes the sound like the bee. Hervey Deo stuttered, he would have flung out a denial. But the other scientists had gathered about. Oh, come, Deo, they urged him. There's a good chap imitate a bee for the professor. Hervey bit his lips. How iss it, encouraged Professor Schwiebel. Bzzzzzzzzz. No, cried Hervey Deo, wildly. Not like that. Like this. Bzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz, bzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz, bzzzzzzzzrf. Ah, most droll, said Professor Schwiebel. You have talent, you are a comedian. You should go on the stage. Hervey Deo could not articulate. Professor Schwiebel addressed him in the tone Hervey knew so well, for he employed it often. It was the tone of tolerance a scientist adopts to a layman. Have you ever taken an interest in birds, Dr. Deo? There are some fine birds a clever fellow like you could learn to imitate. Hervey Deo did not enjoy that dinner. He was up at daybreak and he attacked his work with a cold and terrible energy. He stuffed a whole family of bobolinks, Dolichonyx drisivorus, and dissected snipe, Gallinago, by the dozen. He sat up till his eyes ached writing a masterly treatise on the habits and home life of the adult pelican, Pelicanus. Deo, the bee-man, his lips kept saying. I.